So BC, obviously we knew this was going to be a smaller class. It looks like everybody but the West Coast guys have gotten their letters of intent in. Um, I guess just what do you make of this class? Obviously, a couple of really high end guys with Impuma and Odom on the top. Just your overall evaluation of the class, including, I guess, whether or not you expected it to be this small, maybe a little bit bigger, and how you just think the 26 class played out overall.
Yeah, I guess probably a few weeks ago, I would have, not a few weeks ago, a few months ago, I would have suspected it would have been, I don't know, maybe 12 to 15 guys. So the fact that it might only land at 10, it's probably slightly smaller than I thought. I've said on this show, Ravi, we've talked about how you evaluate classes, I think is different
Mm-hmm.
than it used to be just because of the portal. And I have like the sandwich theory where you almost have to look at like the class and what's each portal thing around it look like, and then combine it all together and who's actually contributing for you. Of course, we know that for better or worse, and people can have all sorts of opinions on this, 91 of Nebraska's players this year were sophomores or younger. So just a simple math situation made it so that you couldn't take as many of this class. We obviously see that they're loading up for 27 and 28 and trying to get way ahead of that. So you have to keep that in the back of your mind. So I would tell people there are concern areas. Don't get me wrong. We saw them the last couple of weeks of this season, and people have expressed them, and that's fair to do so. But I don't think Nebraska's national ranking in this particular class is near the top of my list. Like when some people use that as a bullet point of how things aren't in great shape right now. I don't think that applies because I think you have to look at a bigger picture than that. And obviously you asked about like, certain guys like Danny Odom. I was going through all of his stuff last night or a couple nights ago. And kid's a stud. I mean, I get the 5-star stuff, and I don't get all caught up in that. But 24/7 Sports ranked him number 31 overall, so he's one of the highest rated Nebraska signees they've ever had. And if you watch him, he is a lockdown corner, has unbelievable body movement when the ball's in the air, great instincts. And the thing I like about him is he slips through blocks. Like guys have trouble like kind of locking him down on the perimeter on blocks, and he'll make tackles. He's not shy to get physical. So all the stuff kind of works together for him to be ranked as he is. That was a huge poll, and we can't forget that just because that one didn't have signing day drama. Remember the day he committed, that was like kind of a back and forth. Ohio State and other schools were involved, and Nebraska got him. So you can't forget about a win like that on today.
Oh, and so when you talk about Danny Odom, I do think I think it's interesting to remember. You mentioned one of the highest rated guys they've ever signed. Rico and I did this earlier. He's the first non-legacy 5-star to commit in 20 years, basically since Marlon Lucky.
Yeah.
And we haven't had a lot of experience with this level of recruit when we're talking about Nebraska. And there was quite a bit of drama with him kind of throughout the process because people thought, I believe Michigan and Ohio State were making really strong runs at him. Is that correct?
Yeah. Day of his commitment, I remember like an hour before we had all our stuff loaded up because there was a very real shot Nebraska was going to get him. But then it was like, no, I think it was Ohio State who was thought to have the upper hand for like an hour or two beforehand. And then there was sort of a delay in his announcement. And so that happens, and you're like, okay, Nebraska got him, but this will be drama filled to the end, right? You kind of get that in your mind. And it actually wasn't. Like he committed to Nebraska and has just stayed steady. Like a couple of weeks ago, he told Tom Loy in our network, it's over, I'm done. And, I'm sure people trying to make a last second at him. They always do with those type of guys. But bottom line is he never wavered after that initial day where there was a lot of back and forth. So that's a heck of a win. Obviously with the DC change, you never know how guys are going to react, but I think he had a really good relationship with Addison Williams, and Addison can recruit. That guy connects with some guys. And so I think you're going to see more of that, as long as he's around here.
As you kind of look at the rest of the class, obviously Odom is the headliner. Is there anybody else as you're like kind of going through these guys? You're like, I just kind of really like this guy. I know people are pretty high on Impuma as well, but is there anybody you've kind of just randomly taken a liking to?
Luke Sorensen out in Cali. I think is probably underrated as a tight end. There were a lot of good tight ends in this class nationally, but I think Nebraska got, one of the best guys. The guys who cover the West Coast believe that too. He's like got size 18 cleats and is just sort of I don't know. He's got freak movements for like a body for his body type. Like he started actually a couple years ago on the offensive line as like 170-pounder, and he's built himself up. I don't know his exact weight, but he's in the 200s now, and he can really move. And he's just a big kid that I think adds some, something to that room. And they need it going forward. Obviously, Lyndon Myers, a guy who has one more year, but we'll see what can happen with Carter Nelson still going forward. That hasn't, jumped off the screen yet. So any addition to there, I think that's a position where you could use a little jolt.
Is there, as you look through this, you mentioned obviously the change in defensive coordinator as well, kind of moving from signing day to what's happening on the staff. Is there, did you get any indication that moved the needle at all for any recruits? You mentioned Odom's relationship was mostly with Addison Williams. Do you get any or is that more going to be a transfer portal thing, do you think, where whoever they end up hiring will be more impactful in who they bring in the transfer?
I think it's more of a portal thing, especially. I mean, that maybe that's a deal where a smaller class helps you, and you also don't know. Like sometimes some coordinators are really involved, like in the recruiting process. And I'm not saying John Butler wasn't, but Nebraska only had, let's see, there's only like 2 defensive guys in this class, so if as long as Danny was fine with his position coach and you didn't rock the boat there, Chase Reynolds is coming, no matter what. So I don't think that one factored in, but it will be interesting in the portal. And that's where, you're looking for the traits about who can coach your guys up on the field first and foremost. But if that guy has that electricity around him, sort of inside the walls that we don't see, but recruits would or portal visitors would, I do think that's a nice added element that you have to factor into this hire. You hate to bring it always back to like Eckler, but Eckler sort of got that package, right, of like what you look for in a guy who runs something, in that he's a great teacher. He can bring it down to a level where when he's explaining something, he could go out, as they've said, to a bunch of 6th graders and get it down to a sentence or two where they understand something and they can execute it. But also he's just got that sort of enthusiasm, which I do think matters as a D coordinator in this hire, where it's like, will players run through a wall for that guy? I know that's cliche, but that does matter. I think, especially on that side of the ball, we've seen it. You'd have to say whatever faults you thought Bo Pelini had, he got the head coaching job here because in 2003, those guys would have done anything for him. And so that kind of mentality, I think, can carry and especially help in the portal stuff too.
BC, as you start to think about who the next defensive coordinator could be, where did you start? Did you start thinking of names you liked or qualities that you wanted in the position?
I think I'm like everybody else, where you're kind of throwing the obvious names at the dartboard, and then there's sort of like, those a little under the radar guys who aren't as obvious. Like you start with the high profile guys, and then you work your way to like the Toledo defensive coordinator and guys like that, who's like, well, maybe that could work too. You kind of start looking at sort of numbers like that. I'm not that far into it yet. I don't know. It'll be interesting today at the press conference, because Rhule's really downplayed. And I think part of it is just he was talking to his players in those press conferences, but he hasn't really been big about that whole like 3-man, 4-man, 5-man kind of discussion that has been out there about like what type of scheme you want. And basically he said in the previous press conferences, just go play, make plays. I've had defenses that have had success stopping the run in all sorts of schemes, but it will be, I think, of curiosity to the fans today to have the itch maybe scratched if he's leaning a certain way, or if he's willing to divulge if he wants to tweak scheme or talk in any way about that, or if that's just not the main factor and maybe he's looking for just like personality traits. I think one of the things you look at though, Ravi, is like, it doesn't have to be this, but it sure would be nice, I think, if the guys the Big Ten life a little bit, been through this league, that would be an added trait that would be beneficial. And also probably a little more experience in, John Butler had as a coordinator. Obviously, he had a great background as an NFL guy, and we can't pretend like when he arrived a year ago, we didn't talk about the fact that he could be the guy to replace Tony White if Tony left. That was always a conversation since he started. So we can't backtrack and say that wasn't out there. But he didn't have as much coordinator experience as maybe you could go get with this hire.
As you kind of go through this, one of the things I keep thinking about is, and maybe this, tell me if this is stupid or not. That's basically what the question is going to be is am I stupid, BC?
No, you're not. You're smarter than me, I think.
We're going to go two different directions with that.
I was going to say, Rico hard disagrees. Is the question I keep, or the quality I keep thinking is, I don't want guys to have to think as much as it seems like they're having to think. Mm-hmm. Like, I feel like that, because we're like, oh, this guy looks slow. And it's like, I know these guys aren't slow. I know they're not. And they may not be Ohio State level athletes, but I know they're not slow. But it looks like they're slow all the time. And I think it's just because they're forced to think too much. And I think part of that is you want a guy that has a little bit of Pelini in him, where you want him to be able to run through a wall for you, or a little bit of Eckler. But I also think sometimes, and maybe this is the case with a guy coming from the NFL who's used to guys that kind of process things on a different level, is they're asked to identify too much in real time, and that makes them slow.
Yeah, I definitely wonder if that was one of the main problems from this defense. And if you go back to the offseason, there was a lot of talk about how they needed to sort of evolve it and extend it. Like, remember, like, there was that conversation about like third down defense and how you have to like have these added elements almost to confuse the quarterback in those spots. And what can end up happening is you as you're getting to, you confuse your own guys, or it just makes them a half step slower, and then you're in trouble. It's been talked about for 48 hours, so it's nothing new. I think John Butler had a tough assignment. I do. Like, with the D line as it was, I thought this was going to be a development year on the field in games, and whenever you're in that situation, it's sort of hard to whatever you do to cover that up sometimes if you have guys that aren't getting off block. So I think you have to recognize that. But I think there is something to what you're saying. How much do we like pay our respects, like when Iowa comes around every year, to those quotes from like Nebraska's staff? Like, they just do what they do, like it's sort of that, like, oh, they kind of do the same thing they've done for 20 years. Dana Holgerson talks about they're doing the same thing they did against us in the Alamo Bowl when I was at Texas Tech in like 2001. And I don't know, there's probably a happy medium between that and sort of where Nebraska was, I think, to your point.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of funny when you put the name Iowa on it, because I don't think it's a secret. I think everybody knows what Iowa wants to do, right? Like, they don't disguise they don't fool anybody, right? Mm-hmm. Like, defensively, they're not tricking you. They just go out and execute at a super high level. And I think sometimes it's really hard, especially with college kids, when you're getting new guys in every couple years, sometimes more than that, to ask them to do too much. And I don't know, that I think for me, you mentioned the things you're looking for, some Big Ten experience. I would love that. At least power conference experience is something I would appreciate. Not saying they can't be successful if they don't have that, but that would be the first thing I look for. And then sort of an offshoot of the simplicity part of it is just find a way to get your best athletes on the field.
And I don't know what the answer to this is. If they had it, they would have supplied it by now. You guys got into this a little bit. I was listening to your show the other day, and it was a segment about like compounding things, basically, like how one thing will sort of lead to another, and it really shows in the red zone stats. Like, maybe you can even the teeter-totter out, like if your run defense is below average, if you're a group that can have takeaways, or inside the 20-yard line, you have the ability to stand up. Nebraska let teams score touchdowns 24 of 31 times. That's like incredible, like bad. I mean, they would have had to be like 25% points higher to have been in the top 25, which was obviously a long way away. They're last in the country in touchdown, red zone defense. And so I don't know what it is, but that's somewhat a mindset. Like you think back like to the USC game, and they're actually playing pretty well. And I think there's some things they can be proud of actually on defense in that game, what they did to Maven with the pass and stuff. But there were like those 6 plays, remember, like where USC scored 2 touchdowns, got the 2-point conversion, all happened. That was like half their offense for the game. And it's a deal where they get that explosive they actually beat Andrew Marshall one time, who had a great game for like 40 yards. And then it's just sort of a problem that keeps happening with Nebraska, where the next 2 or 3 plays sort of follow down the slide. You know, they just can't. I always think of the Weezer song, if you pull the sweater and watch it come undone. Like that, Nebraska's sort of been stuck in that loop, and I don't know what to say about it, because we've talked about it on the show, and even in mid-season, we're kind of like, they do all the hard stuff off season. I think their mat drills honestly would be harder than a lot of places, and they make them go through this stuff. And it's just like it hasn't quite translated into whatever it needs to be in some of those moments. Maybe it's youth on defense, and that's a big part of it. But somehow, some way, whoever comes in here is going to have to interject that, like, that play's gone. We have the men in black wave the thing in front of your face, and it's gone. And so I don't know, somebody who has that magic ability, if he can convince Matt Rhule of that in the interviews, he's the guy you hire.
So, we talk about staying on schedule on offense a lot, and we do a little bit on defense in the sense of like, hey, you want to stay out of 3rd and short situations, right? But you brought up an interesting point there with kind of the big chunk play to over Andrew Marshall, like the 40-yarder or whatever, right? And I kind of sit here and I wonder, do we think frequently enough about sort of those plays that get the defense off schedule and put them in a position where they maybe feel like they have to do something different? Because that almost, I feel like it's either that or they're just more mentally fragile than I want to admit.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. That's what they've got to somehow get to the bottom of, and they've been trying to for a few years. That's the part where I'm most like concerned, I guess, right now, is like, because I do think they've done a lot of stuff to try to solve that situation about, backs to the wall, building that sort of toughness within your team where, one, you feel comfortable in a 4th quarter like Iowa has for so many years. And 2, what we're talking about here, where, okay, you gave up a play, big deal. That's going to happen. Make the next one. I don't know how you get that mindset in your defense. And that's where I do think the mentality and sort of how whoever this DC is, how he's able to portray himself to Rhule, and like how you handle those sort of situations as a coach is actually a big part of it. Like if you can find that guy who has that ability to sort of get guys, or has on his resume, like you look at their red zone defense in the past, and they stand up when they're in a tight spot, because that was where the season flipped in a lot of ways. We could say it was run defense, but the red zone offense and red zone defense, it just wasn't there. And there's something that's almost beyond the football. You wonder sometimes, it almost goes to the mind on some of those things.
Is there anything, this is just something that I've been noticing online when people are talking about the defensive coordinators that they want Nebraska to bring in. Is there anything in your mind to do with being a defensive backs coach and a defensive coordinator, or being a defensive line or linebacker and being a defensive coordinator, and kind of like the position that they know the best, and how that translates to how the defense performs in that area?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think finally a good question.
I've been waiting.
Somebody had.
Yeah, someone had to ask one. I guess the obvious answer is probably, like, right now you're thinking, like, I'd love a guy who's sort of maybe has been more dialed into the front 7 in some ways, because you do feel like I think they got a really good secondary coach that they need to keep in Addy. I like a lot about him. I think he can be good with the players. He has his own coordinator experience that can lend itself to another guy if this DC is more D-line oriented or has been in his past. I think someone who's been connected to the front and the trenches could be useful. It doesn't have to be that, though. This is one of those deals where, you try to put all these things in a box and like say, well, you got to have this, this, and this, and you end up with like 7 or 8 different things, and you're not going to check off every one of them. So there's got to be a little bit of just a feel to the hire, and like this guy fits, and he can explain his plan, like I think Eckler did. Back to Eckler. Remember Matt Rhule wasn't sure he wanted to hire Eckler, not because he knew he had a great resume, but he knew he was kind of a rock star coach around here and kind of wanted to get away from that. But Eckler, I think, was able to explain, as we've been told, how he teaches stuff and like how that can translate. So I think that's the biggest thing is wherever this guy's background is he that guy that you get the sense like he can get a guy across the table from him and explain things in a way where that guy can process it and go make the play that he just screwed up on Tuesday, the right play on Wednesday, and then not let it be in his head on Saturday and just go play. So I don't know. It's going to be interesting what kind of background he has. I guess to your question, I would go back and say if there's a D-line, like if he's kind of been from that pedigree, you might like it right now, but it doesn't have to be.
What's funny is I think the guy that's number one on almost all fans' boards is a defensive backs coach first.
Yeah.
Oh, no, not again.
Jim Leonard. Jim Leonard. I mean,
yeah. And you know what, though?
And everybody would roll to death about that hire.
Oh, they would. So that's the thing. Like, I mean, you can't cross it all off. It's a good question, though. But I mean, you'd have to say, if you look at Jim Leonard's background, obviously maybe you think of him DB's coach, passing game, defensive coordinator, all that stuff. But go back to his like Wisconsin defenses. I mean, they were stout usually against the run. And like Iowa, it wasn't a defense. They were, I think, a defense you would have said you kind of know what they're going to do. But guess what? You look up in November 20th and they're 8th in total defense and 7th in rushing defense back in those days. So, yeah, people would be over the moon with that hire.
So let me ask you this. We'll get you out of here, BC. What would be, obviously, the tenor of the offseason changed with the Iowa loss, especially how the Iowa loss went down. What would lift your spirits the most in the offseason? Getting whoever your number one guy on the defensive coordinator board is, or replicating a top 10 or 15 transfer portal class the way they did last year?
Both. They need both. I mean, it's got to be someone who, when he's hired and he comes in, he kind of ignites things, and there usually is that energy. Heck, I remember when Bob Diaco came here, there was a lot of talk about like what his Notre Dame red zone defense did the one year they had success and were like 12-0 or something. And so people will probably convince themselves to get fired up, but hopefully it's just sort of natural where you're like, I see it. Like I see what he's done and how he communicates it already. Like in the early press conferences, this is a guy who looks like he's going to be successful. That would help turn the page. But then I do think you got to combine that with a couple big portal hauls, 1 or 2 probably on that defensive line. And, we'll see how the quarterback situation plays out. That's going to be a big thing. So there's like 4 or 5 different things that are mood shifters. The one thing, it's not a knock on anything, but today could have, in some years, would be that day that, Ravi, where you could kind of turn the page, right, a little bit if you had like that, if you had like your 27 class this year and it sort of worked out numbers wise where there was all this juice around it, but that's just not the case. So I think it's going to have to wait till the coordinator hire and the portal stuff if you're going to kind of get people like back where they put the Kool-Aid back in the closer to the fridge, they might grab it occasionally.
BC, you mentioned the quarterback situation. How much do you think, say, Dylan saying, yes, I'm coming back, or putting an announcement like he did last year, what kind of mood changer is that in your scale?
I think it would help. I mean, I think there's some excitement too about Latif, and there's like a portion of the fan base that can go either way with that. But bottom line is you've got a guy with Dylan's experience and former 5-star status. I think if he were back, he's meant a lot to portal recruitment too.
Mhm.
I don't know that anybody, this is not a knock on Latif either, but I don't know that he could translate the way Dylan has to like some of the portal guys, right? Like you think about Isaiah Hunter and Dane Key. Like Dane Key is the guy like messaging Dylan like 2 days before he is going to make it public, like I'm in, like that. They had that type of relationship.
Mhm.
And so I think that's a big part of it too. Like if he came back, you sort of maintain that star status at the position that is useful in recruiting and the portal. We're seeing it with Trey Taylor, obviously.
That is Brian Christopherson, Husker247. BC, appreciate the time as always. And I'm sorry you don't have the adrenaline rush on signing day that you used to. Maybe next year.
Yeah, next year I think we'll get it. Anyway, I'll go to my 4th cup of coffee. I'll be fine. Thanks for having me on as usual.
You could just go cover Vandy and get a 5-star quarterback to flip from Georgia.
Weird times, aren't they?
BC, we appreciate it. We'll talk to you later.
See you guys.